In this video, we're going to be getting your feet wet in the world of 3D. What I'm going to do is introduce you to the Cinema 4D interface, get you familiar with the menus, kind of what's what, and how to navigate around in 3D space. Now, a lot of your comfortability and efficiency in Cinema 4D is going to come down to you practicing and committing a few useful keyboard shortcuts to memory. That being said, let's go ahead and dive in. So you're going to see we have a lot of buttons here, but what I want to do is just start out with this row of buttons and icons right here. Now, these icons contain all of the different types of objects that you can create inside of Cinema 4D. If we go down to the bottom here, you can see there's this light icon. If I click and hold, this will reveal all of the different types of lights we can add to our scene here. If we go up to the top, and if I click and hold on this little rectangle icon here, you can see this will reveal our spline menu. Now, splines are much like your After Effects, Photoshop, Illustrator paths, or say shape layers in After Effects. But instead of calling them paths, they're called splines. Now, if we go down to this menu right below with the cube and click and hold, this will reveal one of the more important menus here. And this menu contains all of your primitive objects. Now, primitives are your basic 3D shapes. And again, much like shape layers in After Effects where you may have rectangles, circles, stars, in Cinema 4D we have cubes, spheres, and platonics, and even a figure object. How cool is that? So these are your building blocks to start making geometry inside of Cinema 4D. So let's go ahead and let's add a cube to our scene. So I'm just gonna release the mouse while I'm hovered over that cube object there. And you'll see that we have a cube that showed up in our viewport, and we also have a cube that showed up in our object manager here. Now, your object manager is where all of the objects in your scene live, much like where all of your layers are in your comp window in After Effects, or your layers in your layer window inside of Photoshop. Now, if I click on this cube, and let's just navigate down to this menu here, it's our attributes manager. And if I go to this object tab here, you can see this actually contains all of the object properties of our cube. So all of the settings that control, say, the size of our cube, the segments, and the fillet, which is basically just the bevel. So you can see if I click and drag on this little area here, we can scrub the value in our size X. Also, with our size Y, size Z, and segments, we can either scrub the slider here or scrub this value here as well. So a couple ways to adjust the segments here. Now, as I adjust the segments, you're not seeing any kind of feedback as we were when I was scrubbing through the size X, Y, and Z. Now, why is that? Well, segments on a cube, you're really not going to see much of a difference. The only way you can see these segments is if we change the mode in which we're viewing our objects. So if I go up to display, see we have all of these different type of display options. And what we want to do is choose garage shading lines. And once I activate that mode, you can now visualize all of these segments, okay? Now, segments are very important when it comes to actually 3D modeling, as well as adding smooth definition to an object. And you won't really notice this here on the cube, but if we go ahead and activate fillet, which again is just your fancy word for rounding, and if I up the fillet radius enough and bring down the fillet subdivision here, you can see how chunky this object looks now. And if I up the fillet subdivision, you can see we're adding more definition and we're smoothing out this object by adding those subdivisions there. So it's a very important concept. If you want to have high definition objects with smooth geometry, you might need to up these segments, and you'll see that when we start exploring some other objects here. Now, just like you can adjust the size and different properties in your object tab, you can also adjust the size and other attributes in the object's coordinate manager. So I can go ahead and we have the position XYZ, so that's what P stands for, position. R is rotation, S is for scale. Now you can see I can adjust the scale in the X, Y, and Z. If you're not quite sure what X, Y, and Z stand for, you can always look up here at this top right and see what X, Y, and Z is. So Y is your up and down coordinate, X is your horizontal coordinate, and Z is that depth, either forward or back in Z space here, okay? So to get a handle on why you have scale coordinates here or size properties here, how you can think of it is if you have a shape layer in After Effects, you have those individual size controls on that shape layer, but on that shape layer, you also have those layer controls like your scale, your rotation, and your position. And this is basically the same kind of concept here. Now you can adjust all of these settings. We got the rotation here. We got the position. We can also control all of these type of options, including object properties within our viewport here as well. Now everything's kind of off kilter. So let's go back into our coordinates and let's just get back to where we started from. And instead of going into, say, all of these rotation, position, and scale values and resetting them one by, say, clicking on these objects, highlighting the numbers in that field and entering 0 and hitting enter for that to take, we can actually reset all of these coordinates back to their default position, rotation, and scale by going up to our tools menu and going to reset transform. And you also notice the handy keyboard shortcuts are listed here as well. So if I use this reset transform, pay attention to what happens over here. So I'm just gonna choose reset transform. You can see it's gonna zero out our XYZ position. It's gonna zero out our rotation, and it's going to reset the scale back to 1 in your X, Y, and Z. Now it's not going to do anything to our sizes here. If we wanted to reset the size and the segments and the fillet radius back to their defaults, to do that, what we can do is hover over this arrow here, and we're just going to right click. I'm going to right click on each of these options here, and you can see that this is going to reset all of these values to their default. So whatever the values were when we created this object, it's going to reset them to those values. Now, the one thing to know about Cinema 4D is that there's multiple ways to do a lot of the same stuff. Now, instead of, say, right-clicking on either of these arrows, we can also just, say, select the size. So if I select just the X, I can select just the single size in the X. I can hold the Shift key down and just select the X or the Y. Or if I select the size, it's going to select all of these size options here. And I can right-click on that text and go to Reset to Default. Okay, and I could do the same thing here as well. Or if I want to reset everything back to default, I can right click on any of these words in the object properties and just go to reset all, and it will uncheck the fillet because by default, when you create a cube, the fillet's turned off. So this will just get you really back to square one as far as when you first created that cube object. And honestly, we don't need to see our segments here anymore, our edges. So let's go back up to display and let's just go back to our garage shading. And again, we have these shortcut keys here, NA and NB. So if I hit N, you're going to see that this is going to bring up this little keyboard shortcut menu. And you can see that if we hit B, that's going to go back to our garage shading with lines. And if we hit N and then A, that's going to bring us back to our garage shading without the lines. So I always use those keyboard shortcuts very often to just see my edges and then quickly go back to turning off those edges. All right, now we have a lot of little gizmos and arrows in our scene. Let's talk about what all of these things do. So first off, let's cover our axis arrows here. And if we highlight one of these arrows, this is the Y axis. And if I hover over and click and drag, you can see that I'm actually moving my cube up and down, constrained on that Y axis. And if I want to, say, move this back and forth in Z space, I can hover over the Z axis and move this back and forth in Z space. If I hover over the X, I can move this along the X axis in positive and negative X. Now we can reset the transform, again, by either going to Tools and hitting Reset Transform. But I'm going to make sure I commit that keyboard shortcut to muscle memory so I remember it's Alt-0. So I'm just going to hold Alt-0, and that'll reset that for me. Now, what if I wanted to rotate this object? Well, to do that, we're going to go into our rotation tool. And you can see on the left side here, a whole bunch of other buttons here. And if you actually notice in the bottom left here, As I hover over these options, you can see that, okay, we've been in the move tool this entire time, so I've been able to move this object. If I go to the button down, you can see this is the rotate tool, and in parentheses or in those brackets is the shortcut key for that tool. So move tool is E, rotate tool is R, and scale is T. So again, if I want to commit these to memory, if I want to bring up the rotate tool, remember that's R, I'm going to hit the R key, and you'll see that we'll go from those axis arrows to these axis bands. If I hover over this green band and click and drag, you can see I'm constraining the rotation around the Y axis. If I go and hover over the Z band, I can rotate this around the Z axis, and same with the X, rotate around the X axis. Now I can also not select any of those bands at all and just rotate this all willy-nilly like. I can also go back to the move tool. Again, if I forget what that is, I just look in the lower left there and see the move tool is E. So I'll go to the move tool, and I can also, instead of actually constraining along an axis, I can move this around all willy-nilly like as well here. And then if I want to scale, remember the scale tool is T, and I can scale this up or down by clicking and dragging. Now you can't quite scale down on individual axes, and we'll cover why that is a little bit later on, but all that is to say is that if you did want to change the size and the X on the cube, just change it in the object tab on the actual cube object here, or you can go into the coordinates tab and adjust the scale there as well. Now let's go ahead and reset transform again by hitting Alt or Option 0. You'll see that I'll zero out the coordinates. Let's go back to the object tab, and let's talk about what these little yellow dots do. Now these yellow dots correspond and adjust the object properties here. You can see if I hover over this yellow dot here and move this up and down, you can see that's controlling the size and the Y. And if I adjust this here, that's controlling the size and the Z. And if I adjust here, that's controlling the size and the X. You can see these little dots here in the corner. If I click and drag, you can see that's controlling our fillet radius, again, which is just that rounding. Now, if we make this big enough, you can see that our edges are quite chunky, and that's where we'd want to up our fillet subdivisions to add more definition and then just smooth out our geometry. Now, if we wanted to go back to our move tool to say move this around, I will hit my E key, and I can kind of move this around. Again, R is to rotate, and T is to scale. So E, R, T, very important shortcut tools there. If I hit E to go back to my move tool, I want to demonstrate why it's not a good idea to just move objects without constraining them in one of these axes. And why that is if I move this over to the left, you'll see that it looks like in this view, I did move this object to the left. But if I bring up my 4-up 3D view, so this is similar to your After Effects 4-up view where you can see different views of your 3D scene from like the top, the side, and all that good stuff. To bring that up, I'm going to go up into this top corner here, and you're going to see this icon with a tiny cube inside of a bigger cube, and this is your toggle active view. And if I click this once, you'll see this will bring up our perspective, top, front, and right view. Okay, you can see that we'll have the wireframe views of our little rounded cube here. Now I'm going to go ahead and let's do this again so we can see exactly what happens when we just move an object all willy-nilly like and not constrain it along an axis. So let's go again and hit Alt or Option 0 to reset transform. And again, I'm going to click and drag and move this to the left. Now you'll notice that I am moving this to the left. If we look at our front view, we are moving this to the left, but we're also moving this forward in Z space. And we're also slightly moving it up in Y space. Now you would never really notice that if you were just looking in this perspective view, but since we have all of these views open, we can see exactly what's happening. So if I Command or Control Z to undo those moves, or you could also do that reset transform, this is why it's important to just constrain along the X, Y, and Z axes, because you can predictably move objects in 3D space without having to worry about things getting off kilter by just randomly moving it. Now, you'll also notice, in addition to these arrows, you'll see these corners. These corners will allow you to constrain movement not along a single axis, but along two axes or a 3D plane. So if I highlight, say, this blue corner here, you'll see this is actually highlighting both the Y and the X axis. This means that if I click and drag while highlighting that corner, I am constraining movement to the X and Y axis. Same thing if I want to constrain to the Z and Y axis. I can hover over this corner and click and drag, and you can see I'm constraining to Y and Z. I cannot move this along the X axis at all, okay? And same thing with this corner here where I'm constraining to the Z X plane. And you can see that. Now you also notice that in each of our views, our top, front, and right views, you can also constrain movement to a single 3D plane. So in the top view, even if you're not selecting this corner, I can click and drag and constrain this along the ZX plane. And in my front view, I can constrain the movement to the YX plane. And in my right view, I can constrain to the YZ plane here. Okay, so very important when navigating and moving objects in 3D space. You do not just want to move it like this in your perspective view, because that'll again throw everything off kilter. So Alt or Option 0 to reset transform, and let's maximize our perspective view by going and clicking this toggle active view to make that full screen. Or we can also use our view shortcut keys, which are F1 for perspective view, F2 to bring up your top view, F3 to bring up your right view, F4 to bring up your front view, and F5 to bring up your 4-up view. So if I wanted to go to my perspective view, I would just hit F1, and now we have our perspective view full screen. Now, so far we've been adjusting and moving and rotating and scaling our object in 3D space. But what if we wanted to change our camera angle, our view angle that we're viewing our object from? Well, the three shortcut keys that are going to be very important that you commit to memory are the 1 key. If I hold the 1 key down and click and drag, this is your pan tool. If I hold down the 2 key and click and drag, this is your dolly tool. And if I hold down 3 and click and drag, this is your orbit tool. Now, one thing to note about your orbit and dolly tool is that you can actually choose where you want to orbit and dolly into. So say if I wanted to zoom into this left corner here, I can have my mouse hover right here, hold the 3 key down and click and drag from this point, and I'm orbiting around that corner. I could also orbit around from this corner, and you'll see that little crosshair there. Now, if I wanted to dolly into this, I could hold the 2 key down, click and drag. I'm dollying into that corner. I can dolly out, and I can dolly into this corner by holding the 2 key down and doing like that. So a lot of control using the 1, 2, and 3 keys to be able to precisely navigate around your object. And if you ever kind of get a little bit too crazy and lose where your object is, which is all too easy, to get back to your default view, just go to this view menu and go to frame default. And this will get you back to that like nice perspective view that is the default when you open up a new project. Now, in addition to using those shortcut keys, you can also use these little icons here, which again, if you look in that lower left, you can see this is the move or the pan camera. This is the scale camera or the dolly. And this is the orbit camera as well. But you should just commit those 1, 2, and 3 keys to memory, so you're not ever using any of these buttons here. And again, use those F1 through F5 keys to change your active view. Now, a few more shortcut keys that will help you work more efficiently in Cinema 4D. One is if you wanted to, say, move your object along the X-axis, but do it in even increments. You can see that if I go to my coordinate tab here to see those coordinate values change, I'm kind of OCD about round numbers, so I hate seeing values like this, like negative 192.058. Now, if you want to move an object and say constrain it in increments of 5, hold the shift key down and you'll actually move this. You'll see that we'll go from these, decimal numbers to increments of 5. And this is really handy when trying to get precise positioning. If I just zero out this X coordinate here by just clicking there and hitting 0 and hitting enter, click this arrow and hold the shift key down, you'll see that I'm moving in those increments of 5. So I can move this over like so. Now, if I wanted to duplicate this cube, the shortcut key for that is the control key. And you'll see that if you hit the control key, you'll have these little boxes show up next to your cursor. If I hover over the X-axis and click and drag, you can see that I just duplicated this object. And if I hold the shift key down as well, I can move this again in increments of 5. And I'll release my mouse and the shift and control key. And you'll see that, well, we have a second cube in our object manager here. Let's actually zoom out, hold the 2 key, click and drag, and I can actually select both of these objects by holding the shift key down and either clicking the object here, or I can just click off of those 2 objects and I can click the cube here in the object manager and select the other cube in the object manager here as well. And if I wanted to duplicate both of these, I can hold the control key down, click and drag, hold the shift key down again and constrain that. And you can see that if I pan down in orbit, I have 4 cubes. Now, in addition to being able to duplicate objects within the viewport directly, you can also use that same shortcut key to duplicate the objects within your object manager. So here I have those 2 cubes that we just duplicated from our original 2. And if I hold the command or control key down and click and drag, you'll see that I'll have this arrow and it'll either be pointing down, which will make these duplicated cubes a child of this cube that I have selected right now, or if I hover down to where the arrow is pointing left and you see this little highlighted line, and if I release my mouse now, you'll see that nothing really happened. We have 2 extra cubes in our object manager, but with those 2 cubes selected, if I just move these 2 out of the way, you can see there's our 5th and 6th cubes. Okay, so you can not only duplicate objects directly in the viewport using those shortcut keys, but also doing the same thing in the object manager here. Now I'm just going to go ahead and delete those extra cubes there. Now I highly recommend that you go in and just start playing around and exploring some of these other primitive objects. So here I have a sphere, and if we go into the object tab, you can see that the sphere has its own unique object properties compared to the cube here. So if I go to the sphere and up the radius, you can see that we're upping the radius. And you can see how chunky this object is. If I go to my garage shading with lines, which again is N, there's that menu there, and we want to go to garage shading lines, so I'll hit B. You can see how big these polygons are. And if I wanted to smooth this out so it wasn't so chunky, I could just up the segments here. You can see we're adding more segments, more definition. We're smoothing out that sphere. I'll hit N and then A to go back to garage shading with lines. You can see we have a handle here, just like the yellow handles on our cube, and this is controlling that radius. Now let's go ahead and add, say, a torus. Let's kind of move this forward and let's kind of zoom in on this. You can see we have 2 dots here. If you look at the object properties, they're completely different and unique from the cube and the sphere. You can see that we have this dot here. This is the ring radius. You can see that update over there. And we also have the pipe radius. And then we have these segments here as well. If we go N and then B, you can see all those segments there. So if we adjust the pipe segments, you can see we're adding more definition along the pipe. If we have ring segments, we can add more segments along that circumference there. Now, if we bring this really low, we kind of have like a triangle kind of deal. So Again, all of these primitive objects are the basics for creating a lot of your base geometry that you'll be using to build up your scenes inside of Cinema 4D. Now, this ring radius really caught my eye. It's 150.562. I'm just going to round that to 150. Hit enter, and we'll control that there. We can also adjust the orientation of where this torus is facing. So a lot of handy, unique options within all of these different primitive objects. And I highly recommend that you play around with them, add a whole bunch of these objects to your scene, kind of see what you can build on your own, and kind of play your own game of Legos and build that muscle memory using those shortcut keys 1, 2, 3, the E, R, and T for the move, scale, and rotation, and the F1, F2, F3, F4, and F5 to getting all of your different active views. Now, one last important thing that I'll leave to you is if you ever want to know what anything is, like if you forgot what a fillet was, all you need to do is right-click on this word and go all the way down to Show Help, and this will bring up a very handy online help menu where you can search for literally anything, and you can see a nice little blurb about what a fillet is, what the fillet radius and fillet subdivisions are, and sometimes they have accompanying imagery. And if you're like me, I like books with pictures, so this is very much going to please my visual mind. You can click on the cube object here and see all of the different settings that the cube has. You can see that this is covering the fillet options, dragging the handles, what do those handles do, all kinds of really interesting things. You can see the disc object and what that is, the figure object, what the heck that is, and all the settings there. So this is such an amazing resource that will be invaluable as you start to learn Cinema 4D and get a handle on what all of these objects and features are. Now remember, practice is going to be the key here. So store all these shortcut keys to memory, as we're going to be leaning pretty heavily on all these shortcut keys to move around and build up our main scene. So once you feel comfortable moving and grooving inside of Cinema 4D, move on to the next video, and we're going to start building up some objects out of all of these primitives.